Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Lucky Penney. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. Collaborative combat aircraft, or CCA for short, represent one of the most exciting and impactful air power developments that we've seen thus far in the 21st century. These uncrewed autonomous aircraft can also team with traditional piloted planes, and they're really incredible. What was once cosmic, straight out of sci-fi, is now slated to hit an operational Air Force ramp in a few short years. And the impact these aircraft will have will redefine core air power realities. So we're here this week to learn more about these aircraft, the underlying technologies and software, and anticipated operational concepts from the people charged with building them. So we've got Mike Atwood from General Atomics and Andrew Van Timmeren from Anduril. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Mike?
Yeah, it's great to be here again. Huge fan of Mitchell and the work. I listen to it, the podcast on the drive-in the morning. So very honored to be with the team here today and to spar a little bit with Anduril.
Yeah, thanks guys for the opportunity to be here. Super stoked to talk about what we're up to. And ultimately, as Mike and I know, we're looking to collaborate with the Air Force, continue to do that and deliver these jets ASAPly. So looking forward to the chat.
ASAPly, I like that. And I'm really excited to see that instead of just choosing one winner and everyone else is losers, that we're moving forward with two designs in parallel, because what both of your companies bring to the fight is really important. So getting back to the idea of autonomous aircraft, people have been thinking about this for a long time. Hap Arnold was involved with early uncrewed aircraft, right? The Kettering bug in 1918. What got your companies interested in this part of air power?
I'll lead that off. Here at Anduril, we are very interested from the very beginning of being a part of bringing modern software into DoD capabilities.
Yeah, because you started out as a software company, right?
Yeah, it's exactly right. From the company founding back in 2017, it was really to bring modern software development, and not just the development of it, but just the ultimate execution and tooling behind that software into the DoD. And so the reason why Anduril pitched into this fight is this is a perfect opportunity to bring that ethos into the air domain. And we're really excited to not just pair modern software development, but also those modern manufacturing capabilities to make a difference in the operational fight. And so that is kind of why Anduril got brought into the mix here.
And Mike, General Atomics is really associated with the Predator and the Reaper. And so you're thought of as iconically bringing remotely piloted aircraft and autonomous aircraft to the fight in modern America.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the other side of the coin from what Scar brought up there. I mean, we're a hardware company at our core. We have 3 decades of carrying the nation's load on our back in counterinsurgency and overseas. And I think we're progressing into a software company. The manning that it takes to fly the MQ-1 Predator and Reaper and its brethren have been a drawdown on our ability to scale, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. And so CCA for us is a super exciting time to kind of reinvent air power yet again, using a reduced manning concept to really focus on a peer level fight versus the CENTCOM fight.
So it's really interesting how both your companies come at this from a different direction. Scar, you mentioned you're coming at it from a software core, and Mike, you're coming at it from a hardware core. Do you think this has created sort of a different perspective and diversity in the two companies and what you're offering?
I think so. I think General Atomics realized through our operation of the Reaper that multi-mission aircraft are extremely important, that the plane will have to move from communications relay to weapons engagement to surveillance kind of fluidically as the combatant commands required. And I think GA has brought a CCA Increment 1 aircraft that's really built around that utility. It has a higher weight point than the Anduril aircraft and is inspired by that multi-mission ideology that we were founded through combat.
I think the other thing when it comes to modern software development, one of the key things you want to do is get out an MVP or that minimal viable product, get something that achieves what the customer end user is looking for, and then continue to iterate from there. With that perspective, making decisions quickly, and we could talk more about the program office and its prioritization of execution, but get that minimal viable product out there, make sure it can accept continuous updates and continuous delivered software in those open architecture frameworks. That is exactly what we're looking to bring to bear with our offering.
So I'm really interested in digging into the manpower element of it, Mike, as you mentioned, and then also what is a minimum viable product of mission autonomy. But first, kind of let's go back in the Wayback Machine and talk about how the CCA journey started, right? The Air Force has been long interested in unmanned aircraft. So we talked about the Kettering bug, but even in World War II, B-17s and B-24s were remotely piloted bomb-filled drones. And of course, the Fire Bee in Vietnam was really famous. I mean, doing basically ISR missions into heavily defended enemy territory. And then, of course, then GA comes in with the Predator and the Reaper. So where did the CCA journey start?
I'll lead off with that. So GA was very focused on winning the MQ-25 program. And when we lost that to Boeing in 2018, we had a huge amount of talent, and we made a strategic decision to invest in air-to-air capability of what the Reaper had done for air-to-ground. And so starting in 2020, so about 5 years ago now, we were awarded a series of contracts from Air4L that became what we consider CCA Tail 1, the XQ-67 Alpha, which flew in February of last year. And so that journey has taken us in an automotive-inspired way to have a genus species, essentially have one skateboard or one centerline chassis that we can turn into an ISR platform, a kinetic platform, a non-kinetic platform, as well as a training platform. And that has provided the basis of where we started the Air Force's Increment 1 program.
I really just want to lean in on how much of what the CCA program is doing, to your exact point in the lead up about the Ryan Fire Bee and other unmanned systems. This is a little bit of a back to the future, because the Fire Bee was actually controlled not just by a ground control station, but it also had airborne control. And it was relaying information back, which was actively used to plan fighter missions in Vietnam. That was 50 years ago. And so I think much of what we're trying to do in the CCA program is certainly leveraging modern autonomy in modern manufacturing. I think both Anduril and GA are happily executing it in that regard. But I really would just implore listeners that if you do research on the depth in understanding and utility of unmanned systems, they are not really new in the air domain. And I do want to give a lot of credit to GA for the last 20 years in the counterinsurgency fight, making a meaningful difference. We don't have enough airborne ISR. And so the utility of unmanned systems is truly critical. But if you fast forward to, so there's a titch of back to the future in some of this.
Well, in the Fire Bee also, though, it did actually go in on pre-programmed routes where it was not controlled by a ground station or an air station, and it was ended up caught by a net, and then we would download what they had recorded. So it had some options for both airborne control as well as really kind of autonomous actions.
Yep, you're exactly right. Fly pre-programmed routes, again, with a known threat laydown, and then get that situation awareness back to the planners back on the ground so they can facilitate the best use of assets in the follow-on mission. And I think it'd be remiss if we didn't bring up the importance of the, as Mike kind of alluded to, Air Force Research Lab, back in the late 2019, 2020 timeframe, you had the Skyborg program. And the Skyborg program was the harbinger of this autonomy effort we're getting after right now, with the intent there of having an overall open architecture autonomy framework established where multiple vehicles could work collaboratively in order to accomplish an overall picture. So now that was seen as a success, and it was a success, and it was taken by then at the time Secretary Kendall and turned into an operational imperative. So this is less of a rewind of the Wayback Machine and more of a near-term machine, but just a couple years ago was the NGAD family of systems, where you wanted to have that unmanned collaborator with this high capability crewed platform to overall create a net benefit that's greater than the individual parts of those two.
Well, and I think that what's really interesting about this is if you look at the technology that enables this new paradigm of collaborative combat aircraft, where in the past we used bandwidth and data links to control the vehicle, we now have the miniaturization of processing, the speed of processing. We've got the cooling capabilities with the appropriate software, and whether or not you want to call that some level of AI, it's the mission autonomy where the vehicle can actually maneuver on its own, make choices about how it actions on that command, if you will. So it's more of a mission intent or a commander's intent between whoever the CCA is connected to and how they're operating. But it still goes back to the Fire Bee in that it's decreasing or changing the risk profile for whatever manned platform, whatever manned aircraft the CCAs are operating with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Scar brings up Skyborg, and that's an interesting data point for me just because GA was the main performer on that program. And we flew what was called CCA Tail Zero on that. And, to your point, Lucky, there was more learning about how the manned-unmanned interface was going to work than the processing and the computers and the data links and the transports. It was eye-opening to the Air Force in that early period, in that 2022 period. Wow, this is very different than the traditional fighter integration handbook. We're going to have to think about this differently. And we're going to have to put humans on the loop and not in the loop. But that was a very exciting time for the renaissance of this CCA.
So talk more about that. What did you learn from the Skyborg program, and how has that shaped your approach to today's Increment 1?
Yeah, and when we went out there, we were flying with F-16s. And so F-16s were attempting to control the airplane over legacy data links, things like Link 16, which were very bandwidth constrained. And at the time, trying to fly an F-16 and generate J-series messages to send over these data links was task saturating the pilots. Mm-hmm. And what we realized after the first set of flight series is there was a certain amount of kind of ground station hover parenting, kind of mission planning, if you will, that the UAVs needed to do. And there was this weird mix between pre-planned and in situ. And we moved away from commanding the aircraft being like heading speed altitude, like an air traffic controller would classically control it, to something that was more intent-based. Hey, go over there and search. Fly over here and provide comms bridge. And I think we began the journey of trusted autonomy. And I think that sent us on kind of an odyssey of what does that mean to trust autonomy, especially when we have very progressive autonomy. We call that reinforced learned autonomy that might not be deterministic. And how do we deal with safety criticality? And I think that's where we're living today. So we've moved from give it ATC vectors from a fighter cockpit to give it intent. Now to how do we trust that it'll close intent? And those are the problems that Anduril and us are solving right now.
Yeah, and I want to also bring back to, again, this is much of what we're trying to do in the utility of these vehicles isn't necessarily brand new under the sun. It's just the mechanism by which it is done. So as an example, in Lucky, you know this, you go out in a 4-ship of Vipers or Raptors back when I was cool, and you have overall intent. So in the absence of me saying anything, number 2, you have a prioritized list of contracts that you need to go execute against. Yeah. And that is what we're trying to do right now in a very, like Mike said, whether it's deep RL, deep reinforcement learning, or just true hierarchical deterministic systems, we want to make sure that it is executing in accordance with what we believe the priorities are. And that is ultimately human on the loop, without a doubt, not necessarily human deeply in the loop, and certainly not human off of the loop. And to bring us back to the aircraft themselves, they have to be able to perform in the arena along the assets they're looking to augment. And so the performance of the vehicle, if you're going to augment fighters, you got to support and fly like a fighter, because the last thing you're thinking about, Lucky, in your Viper is like, why is this dude not keeping up? Or why is he not at my 3.9 or whatever the tactically relevant formation is?
From a survivability perspective, it's not just aerodynamic performance, it's survivability performance, right?
No doubt. And so you can have amazing autonomy, but the vehicle doesn't support it, then it's not very effective. And so that is really getting after the ultimate hardware has to be designed to facilitate the success of the manned platform. Yeah. And so operating like a fighter is critical.
And I've said that for a long time. People don't realize that the design of aircraft is tightly coupled to its mission and to the geography with which it needs to operate. So whether or not that's range, payload, speed, maneuverability, elements of survivability, that's really what are the design trade-offs for the hardware, for the actual aircraft platform itself. And then you can missionize it as necessary, whether or not that's sensors or the autonomy. And so I think decoupling the software piece from the hardware piece and understanding that the hardware, the aircraft actually has to match who it's teaming with is a crucial component. I mean, it's got to match the team as well as mission geography.
No doubt. If you wanted to accomplish air superiority, you wouldn't team an F-35 with a C-17. You have to have like capabilities, and it gets back to your exact point. What is the why? What is the mission you're trying to do? Let's work from the target backward. What's the threat landscape? And let's mitigate that effectively. And so I'm 100% with you on all that.
Mike, I want to dig into the trusted autonomy piece that you were talking about, because I think for a lot of folks that are pretty savvy about artificial intelligence, machine learning, trust is one of those big questions they often have, especially if you don't have insight and it's not really that explainable. How do you get to that level of trust?
Yeah, it's going to be a little bit of a monologue here, but I have the unique fortune to have seen 2.5 decades of unmanned system development. And I was part of the original Project Maven imaging software that was machine learning at the time on the Predator program. And that was to basically pattern imagery we got of SAM sites and people and trucks and have it automatically identify for the RPA pilot what was going on. That then turned into another program called Smart Sensor, where we added flight automation to the airplane. But it was still needing a whole bunch of data from CENTCOM to train the models. So the machine learning in this case was called supervised and then ultimately unsupervised learning, where we generated computer graphics and fed that to the machine. But when we came to CCA and the beginning of Skyborg, it was clear that we didn't have a bunch of pattern data of a J-20 flying with a J-16 with its wide body air warning. We just didn't have data to train on. So everything he had done up until that point really wasn't possible on CCA. So we departed from that and started doing reinforcement learning. Basically said there's a cat, a Chinese adversary, there's a mouse, there's the Americans, and there's a piece of cheese that we want. And basically run that model as many times as you can where the mouse gets the cheese, but the cat doesn't eat the mouse. Now the cat has a saber. Now the mouse can fly. Now it's 3-dimensional. Now the cheese molds and there's a time component, and you start adding physics on top of physics on top of physics, and you create this hyper real virtual environment, and you train now what I'm going to call AI. So I'm moving past ML to AI, all the different behaviors it can do. And what comes out of that is what we call an agent, a reinforced agent. And that's what we're testing right now. Now, the problem is that mouse trained in an environment that a fighter pilot has never seen. It's trained in another world that he's never experienced, sitting inside the threat bubble of a peer level competitor. And it behaves very differently than the handbook. And so we're at our point now of to scripted logic tables that Scar mentioned to reinforce learning. Where is this balance of warfighter acceptance? And we talk about live virtual constructive. We talk about doing the big video game party in all of our simulators. But what I'm finding is the only way to gain trust is to go out to the middle of the desert with a bunch of fighter pilots and go do it for real.
Yeah.
Manage your money on your time with 24/7 digital banking on the PenFed mobile app. Easily make payments, transfer funds, and deposit checks through mobile deposit.
That's music to my ears.
Learn more at penfed.org. Federally insured by NCOA.
So how are you finding when you take the software out of the lab, out of the simulation, and you squirt that into an actual jet, how are you finding that transition?
Yeah, I mean, great story. Just a month ago, Shield with their HiveMind software was able to deploy to our CCA and fly in a large force scripted exercise. And it became very clear to Shield how hard this is when you do it for real. It's great when you're on your computer at your desktop drinking your coffee, but when you have tankers involved in EM spectrums, all those physics that I mentioned before stack up to a level of the real world. And a lot of times the academic runs away. And so what we're doing now is to gain trust is we're using the live flight testing to validate the virtual environments. Because of course, in live flight testing, you can't do every permutation of the altitude blocks and all of that.
Yeah.
And we're getting trust in the virtual. So when they go sit in their F-35 simulator at the joint simulation environment, when they go out to Boeing's virtual warfare center, it behaves exactly what they saw when they were sitting in that jet for 4 hours. And now they have the trust that what they're training on is what's actually going to happen in the real world. And they're starting to explore the tactics, training, and procedures that they want to use. So we're using the validation of live flight testing to give them trust in the simulators and let the simulators drive the training and tactics right now.
That's really interesting. How do the agents handle humans? Because humans are not clean. We don't always stick to our blocks. We often do unpredictable things. How do the agents respond to that?
Yeah, I'll go in there.
Live flight.
Scar, get a word in here. The problem we are having right now is debriefing autonomy. So when you come back to your squadron room and you're sitting there and you're trying to debrief, why did the human do this and why did the autonomy do that? Generally, the humans are making the wrong decisions and they're being put in a disadvantaged position. So how do you now have a fighter pilot talk to a software programmer and explain to him why he did what he did and how we can create a competitive advantage in the war fight? And how does a guy that thinks in OODA loops now talk in JavaScript? And so it's almost like we need these human translators right now that can speak fighter pilot to a millennial Coke drinking software developer. And so that is really where we're spending a lot of time, is converting the Rosetta Stone classic fighter pilot to artificial intelligence reinforced learning.
Which is USCAR.
Here's where I would jump in and say, and you know this, Lucky, as well as I do, that the only way that you can earn your right to demonstrate your tactical prowess is if you are on frequency on time, if you taxied on time, if you took off and conducted the departure in accordance with procedures. Because how many times have we flown wingman where like the guy's not on the right frequency, he's not in the right formation, and then suddenly half of
big cloud shoes.
That's right, half of your brain is dedicated to what is this dude doing? Let alone let me allow him to be unleashed and demonstrate his tactical prowess. And so I actually just want to bring this back to a way more fundamental level and just say the sooner we get, and I want to like focus this a little bit more on the hardware and the vehicles. The sooner we get these vehicles out and flying around the flagpole, the better all of this will be. The sooner that we get a handful of these air vehicles, with maybe in concert, some GA and Anduril aircraft at the same time conducting a mission, then we can start to learn about that more. And so the 42 and the 44, they have to take off on time. They have to start their engines on time. They have to taxi on time. They have to take off on time. They can't get violated on the way to the airspace, right? They have to fence in all their sensors appropriately. And then, oh, by the way, I can say commit. And then you go conduct what you said was the tactical prioritization. And so the most fundamental thing I would say of all of this, and everything I just described actually is very deterministic. The flight management software on the Airbus or Boeing airplanes that you fly every single day do this right now. But we have to do this with these high performance aircraft in very challenging scenarios that Mike outlined well. And then we can demonstrate our tactical prowess. I think we can get through that very quickly. And I'm excited. One of the unique opportunities about the CCA program is this dedicated unit called the EOU, or the Experimental Operations Unit. Yeah. And I would commend listeners to listen to the podcast that you guys did with Doubled, who is going to be the director of it, or is the director of it. They are going to look to learn as quickly as possible, get after those low-hanging fruit, and then start to create those stretch goals for these for the tactics associated with these vehicles. How are we going to maintain them? How are we going to deploy them? And so the exciting thing about this program isn't necessarily just the hardware, and it's not necessarily just the autonomy, but it's the methodology and the mindset associated with how we want to experiment with them and learn as quickly as possible. I think that is one of the great things that the program office has stood up, and I'm super excited for us to get after it.
So, Mike, I want to dig into something that you were saying. So you're like, the pilot made a mistake, and the autonomy was smarter than the pilot, and it was doing its thing. But sometimes, humans do make mistakes, but they are also able to recover from it. But sometimes humans also innovate and do something unpredictable and unexpected that might seem like it's sub-optimized, but actually ends up being a better tactical or operational choice. How do you get the autonomy to follow or support the manned aircraft? And why are we always making the assumption that the autonomy is smarter?
Yeah, the quick answer is we don't follow the humans. The AI in the reinforced model has already seen the human make a non-standard maneuver situation, and it already knows for that time step what the best possible outcome would be. It's been very interesting to watch pilots, especially fighter pilots, kind of get told that the machine is better than them. And I think we've seen this time again, whether it's chess playing IBM robots or Watson doing something or a large language model writing a book sometimes. I think where I've seen there's a certain art to it, there's a certain aesthetic that a pilot brings, that the machine is very cold And I think that when you talk about warfare, I'm not sure art has a vote in how artistic your Cobra maneuver was, how the vortices came off your wingtips when you did it. It's, did you get yourself in the right shoot, look, posture to close the weapon shot better? But again, I bring this back to, it's about ultimately these fighter pilots wanting to work with this and trusting it, and just beating them over the head in a red flag, orange flag, gray flag exercise doesn't seem to be the way. We need to bring more benevolence to the collaboration between man and machine. I will say, to Scar's point about the EOU, I applaud what they're doing, the philosophy of an experimental operations unit. It's almost the admittance that we don't know what we're doing. We're kind of wandering in the dark. You know, we're very fortunate that we're about to give the EOU, the XQ-67 here, just coming up in a couple months here. So they're going to have their very first hardware. They're going to get the first sniff of the MQ-42 and 44 here. So super excited by that. And then when we talk about determinism and starting with determinism, G is very different in Anduril in that we've been providing that level of deterministic UAV performance for 15 years. A Reaper will arrive at the instrument approach point within a couple seconds of its assigned arrival time. Calculating for the winds, the densities, all that stuff, it's never on the wrong frequency because it's on the frequency that was in the comms plan before you took off. And I think unmanned airplanes have a unique advantage to be, what was it, on time and on frequency 100% of the time. And that's why you see MQ-9 Reapers have more than a 90% availability rate for the U.S. Air Force right now.
So it's interesting. You mentioned like the human machine competition. And in chess, we've seen open AI routinely beat human chess players. But then when we see humans teamed with AI, they routinely beat the software alone by itself. So there's clearly something about human cognition and the human element that makes that teaming far more lethal than the software just by itself.
Yeah, I would lean in heavily on that. I think in the same way that when you think about an operational plan, you have a range of capabilities ranging from mobility, tanking, ISR, fighter, bomber, all bring their unique strengths. And when you collaborate all that and cohesively create a plan together, then again, I'll just reiterate, the sum of those parts is much greater than them individually piecemeal. And I think as you're describing there, Lucky, is the research backs that out or bears that out. As a crewed fighter pilot in their jet, Raptor F-35, Strike Eagle, whatever it is, they get this unmanned system that can increase their threat essay, increase the level of risk it's willing to accept because they're willing to push forward and put the risk on that unmanned asset in order to achieve that mission outcome. I think that overall collaboration of the manned platform and the uncrewed vehicle has the opportunity in a warfighting setting to create that 1 + 1 = 3. And so that is where the YFQ-44 and the 42 are going to shine as augmentees to crewed capability. I think that's where the critical part here is.
I was just going to add in a little bit where I've seen the autonomy fail us from a kill chain optimization standpoint is we don't have the ability to put all the physics in, all the maneuvers. And it's really hard to model a human in computer code. And ultimately, I think these U.S. Air Force robotic airplanes are going to be going up against some level of adversary human. And I think where the ingenuity of the fighter pilot comes in, and it's the thing that we forgot to model or didn't model in the simulation. And it will be able to provide that corner case that neural network table never traversed because we didn't put that boundary condition in the model. And there will always be an essential element of the human having that adaptability to something that extends past what we are able to imagine as engineers.
So I'm really curious, Mike, you'd mentioned that you've got AI on board. And so a lot of folks will conflate AI, ML, and think that it's that dynamic, continuously gonculating. It's going to be doing something different and adapting. But also, as we're realizing, that takes a tremendous amount of code and processing and chips. I mean, huge data centers. Microsoft just bought 3 Mile Island to stand up nuclear reactors to power their data centers. How do you swap-C this into a CCA?
Yeah, I mean, I think back to the kind of the lead-in about Reaper and being multi-mission, there's something special about a 12,000-pound airplane when it comes to aerodynamic and physics. There's some utilitarian point there. I would say that carrying around about 200 pounds of processing equipment is reasonable in that size class. And I'll tell you, from the autonomous car industry, we've seen huge advances in NVIDIA's ability to process the type of GPU and CPU power that we need. I think we're living in a renaissance of technology where somewhere around 200 pounds and 10 kilowatts of processing power allows you to do almost up to some of the quantum computing things that we're looking at that enable the maturity of AI that we have today. Again, it will scale to infinite, but I think there's a Goldilocks position we find ourselves at with technology, software, and again, back to the physics environment that we're training in. They all seem to be converging on something that can be realized in the very near term, within the next couple of years. And then additionally, with these high bandwidth pipes that we're giving to the UAVs, we can do a lot offboard right now. There are things emerging like the Joint Fires Network, which are the supercomputers that are looking at the entire globe of blue and red and how to pair it. And then they can subdivide that into a targeting grid that can be realized by the swap compute, the side weight and power that's on our CCA aircraft.
Yeah, that's really interesting because when you talk about bandwidth and data links in a EW contested environment, spectrum contested environment, you have to begin to think about where your priorities are. And if you're offboarding your basic flight controls and agent functions, I think we're putting ourselves into a position that might be suboptimized. But if you're looking at it from how do we share, how do we complete fires, and then you've got resiliency that is at the forward edge of the battle space with organic capability, I think that there's a lot that can be brought there that can scale globally, Mike, as you said, but also be very effective in a densely contested environment.
Yeah, and I would say when it comes to the data links, and then that dovetails into the command and control of these vehicles, the most important thing is that packet of data. The most important thing, in the same way when in a crewed platform, you key the mic and you say, Raptor skate, or whatever the command is, that is the most important thing you get out over the airwaves. And so here in this case, you want, when via some semblance of human-machine interface or HMI, that packet of data that says that has the command has to be able to get to the platform.
Yeah, and I think to just bring our listeners into a little bit of the reality of it, I mean, if you can think about a filing cabinet and stacking that full of laptops, the nicest Dell laptop you can buy, that's the kind of processing power we're talking about. So maybe 30, 40 laptops worth of high-end gaming. And then when we talk about off-board versus onboard high-power compute, think about your phone, right? Siri depends on you having an internet connection because they can't process the large language model on the phone. But it can do a lot on its own. Your Google Maps will work offline. Your camera will take great pictures and be in cinematic view. And so I think we have a lot of inspiration from commercial technologies on what the state of art in processing is and where it should be done.
Well, then I clearly need to upgrade my Google Maps, because if I'm offline and I don't have cell connection, I have no idea where I am or how to get anywhere.
All Trails. I'll do a plug for All Trails.
Yeah, that's true. I will too. Scar, so let's take this conversation because you'd mentioned a minimum viable product for autonomy. How is Anduril approaching that?
It really, I'll just bring it back to even further the hardware. And at the very beginning of the design of the vehicle, it has to be able to be keyed towards the overall mission set. And so one of the things I really would additionally applaud the program office for is the desirability of these actually being less of a demand on the logistics footprint, less of a demand on overall sustainment, less of a demand on the human capital required to operate them. Mike and I did a panel at AFA in March about the logistics associated with CCA, but that ultimately where you win that MVP and where do you get the best solution is way back at that initial design. If you think that your vehicle has to be able to do a million different things and be all things to all people, that inherently and unfortunately complicates that design. But if you stay focused on the particular mission set that you're looking to get after in the particular theater that you're trying to mitigate threats against, then that facilitates your quick decision-making to get after that very high capability, but get that capability out the door quickly. I think one thing that gets into overall MVP mentality as well from software as you transition it to hardware is how do you value cost, schedule, performance when it comes to an overall program as well? And I just want to make sure that we recognize the value of schedule as a capability. And I think, Mike, you probably would agree, and listeners should key in on the fact that militant adherence to the schedule is a lethal capability all its own, because it forces decision-making to get the capability out there as quickly as possible.
Well, and I would also say the third offset is about time.
Yes.
It's about how quickly you can adapt, how quickly you can field, how quickly you can operate. Because with technology being fairly democratized, it's proliferated everywhere. The smart engineers don't just live in the US. There are a lot of really smart PLA, Chinese engineers, and across other nations as well. So we can't assume that there's some special magic sauce, although I do believe in American exceptionalism, but there is something very special about us. But there are a tremendous amount of smart engineers everywhere. So the faster we can do it, the better.
Yeah, and using in like aviation colloquialism, the runway that's behind you is pretty worthless. And the time that we didn't use to get capability fielded is also wasted time. And if we truly value and desire to deter threat in the immediate term, you must adhere to the overall prioritization of schedule in the cost performance schedule kind of mantra.
Yeah, and to just give a different perspective on that, we've had an amazing system program office to support both Anduril and General Atomics that's doing this agile acquisition. So it's a really paradigm shift in the amount of trust that is put in the contractors from the Air Force. And that's allowed, these sub 3 year, I'd say even sub 2 year development cycles to bring capability out quickly. I think where I want to challenge my SPO to even go farther in agile acquisition is to do a combat deployment. For most of my time, I've learned through the Predator Hellfire, the MQ-9 JDAM, some other activities that I've been a part of, that we got to do a combat evaluation very rapidly. We got to put it out in the real battle space as quickly as possible and see how the adversary responds to it and look at how they treat it. And I think CCA being unmanned and attritable is a unique opportunity to get out there very early and often. And if we're going to see our adversary level up us on speed to ramp and bring, like they did with the 6th gen fighter that they just recently flown, we want to bring that lesson learned back to our 6th gen fighter. And so I cannot stress enough about the point that Scar's making. Speed to ramp, speed to capability, and ultimately speed to combat readiness has to be the driving principle of the program that we're executing.
Well, that's fundamentally in General Atomics' DNA, right? With the Predator and how that ended up being fielded. I think that is really core to a lot of what General Atomics does. Are you seeing the EOU leaning into that?
Absolutely. I think they're leaning into it in philosophy. I think the EOU's been tapping their toe waiting for hardware on ramp, right? And so GA was in a unique position to bootstrap that and provide them with the XQ-67, provide them with the MQ-20s. We weren't going to make them wait to clear the flight envelope on increment 1 to really sink their teeth into that. So that will be a good preamble appetizer to the main meal, which is really the TTPs that we talked about with the mission autonomy and how we talked through the different aspects of how we're going to do that. And then back to a little bit of autonomy, transcending back to agile combat employment that Scar brought up. GE is in a very unique position where we have about 8 million flight hours of condition-based maintenance that we brought home on an all-electric aircraft. And so we were able to provide the Air Force with very deep assurances on agile combat employment and how you're going to operate these planes forward with essentially the minimalistic amount of manpower. And I really feel that both Anduril and GA have transformational solutions in low maintenance, both in aircraft systems as well as low observables, to provide the warfighter with a higher availability than even they're seeing on the MQ-9 program today.
And I think we should also be transparent about some of these unknowns, that getting a deployment under our belt with these vehicles, a high number of them as soon as we possibly can, so they can go be subjected to the elements, get out into the real world airspace, conduct operations. That is where we will learn exactly what the logistics footprint will end up being. And this is one of the key theses of these platforms. And this is one of the key differentiators when it comes to CCA in comparison to RPA, is the unmanned systems up to this point, we really haven't quite realized manpower savings from unmanned systems. We just moved the manpower to somewhere else physically on the planet, but it's still the same size, same ratings, same training. We have still an airplane that's out and about, and it still has the exact same crew in the same maintenance footprint, in the same logistics tail. It just may be disaggregating the crew from the physical location. And so one of the main theses of this entire program is it just must be less. What is the logistics footprint? We'll figure that out, but it must be less. Like, what is the maximum number of air vehicles that a Raptor pilot or a command and control element or whatever can command? It just must be more. And so we are looking to get to that greater ratio of capability to the humans applied to that capability. That is one of the key theses of this entire program.
No, absolutely. So less manpower on the ground to launch, support, et cetera. Greater capability, so a higher ratio of CCA to crewed platform. But we need to test that out. We need to make sure that
100%.
That's how that operates. And Mike, you had brought up manpower in the very beginning. What operational concepts, how do you see CCA being deployed, postured, positioned? Where do they live within the battle space? How do we transport them there? How do we launch them? How are you thinking about that?
I think I listened to a Mitchell podcast recently with General Houston, and it was very interesting, this analogy he brought forward of the Air Force today is like playing football, right? We amass this giant force, we put them on the field, we put them at the right yard line, we go hut, hut, hike, and then everyone fiercely combats for a very short amount of time, and then we regress. I think what I've experienced is in the RPA, the remotely piloted aircraft land, it's been more like soccer. We're always there all the time. We're moving around the field. We're moving the ball from here to here, and we're trying to exploit opportunities. I contend that CCA will be operated all day, every day to enhance the battle pace picture, to be the indication and warning for the game of football to start. And so to do that, I want to do highly autonomous missions flown from beyond line of sight control stations that are one-to-many type ideology, where I'm using mouses, not HOTAS, to fly these large area indication and warnings and all day, every missions. But then when we go to transition to football, the same airplane can be used in the hut, hut, hike, where a HOTAS from a fighter is actually being used very tactically to command intent at a maybe 1-to-1, 1-to-2 ratio level. So I think CCA is interesting because it poses an opportunity to do all flavors of it, as long as we don't start with the two-person in a GCS flying one airplane. General Atomics is more or less trying to get out of the GCS business, the ground control system business, because we don't think it is needed in the future.
So, and that's really interesting because one of the things that we found at Mitchell Tabletop Exercise when looking at those operational concepts is a major value of CCA and how they altered the risk profile of certain missions and really increased lethality was that high ops tempo, was that persistence presence. And it wasn't persistent necessarily because it was loitering, but it was a part of mass, and it maintained the pressure on the adversary so they never had the time to rest, to reset, to reload, and to react, right? So that really gave the advantage to blue forces as they came in as manned-unmanned teams.
And how do you get high ops tempo? You enable high ops tempo by having high availability rate. How do you have high availability rate? By lowering that overall logistics footprint. How do you overall lower that logistics footprint? By using readily available components and parts. And so one of the great things about this program as well is in its overall adherence militantly to schedule, I'll just keep saying that. Maybe I need to come up with a different adjective here other than militant, is it forces you to make decisions on what's available and put that together in a novel way to create this new capability. So we can pull replacement parts off the line that's hot. I don't have to mother may I and pray that the supply chain stayed warm for this bespoke, unique thing only to my platform. That is,
and I want to double down on what Scar's saying. And again, a unique advantage for General Atomics here. We have over 600 MQ-9 Reapers deployed to every corner of this globe with ready supply chain standing by of an all-electric aircraft. The CC aircraft enjoys that opportunity and basically already today has forward deployed spares for all of its major components. The engines are from commercial turbofans, and those have MROs, maintenance, repair, and overhaul stations around the globe today. So again, CCA is unique in that it already has its supply chain deployed around the globe, where something like the F-35, that is a bespoke engine that has to stand up MRO at each of the locations. So I think we are very ready to begin these combat deployments and really start seeing the choke points that we weren't able to identify early in the program.
I think it's really valuable is that you are developing from a known production line. You've got economies of scale. You're using a lot of common components, and that's going to provide benefits overall. How do you handle tech insertion then? I mean, at some point in time, we'll need to do that tech insertion.
Yeah, back to the modularity of the skateboard. I mean, being a multi-mission aircraft for the last 30 years, we're trying to embrace the newest standards. We're trying to provide both hardware and software interchangeability. The government and the System Program Office have done an outstanding job of defining next generation architectures that incorporate the lessons learned from the F-22 and the F-35. I think we're starting to see kind of almost like a Tesla mentality of a more software defined over the air aircraft being possible, where we're looking at systems on the aircraft being multifunction now that can be harnessed by different software skills. And I think CCA will probably be the first asset in the United States Air Force that will enjoy this software ecosystem and these interchangeable skills and hardware to a level that we've never seen before.
So I want to go back to what you were talking about, Mike, regarding combat deployment. We need to be tested in combat. How do you debrief out of that? As you mentioned, there's a challenge right now. Like, you bring humans back. How do they debrief the AI? How do you debrief and how do you learn from those combat deployments?
Yeah, we don't have the answer right now. We're trying to figure that out. We're coming up with metrics like number of targets and time and track of those targets. So a good CCA day where it gets a pat on the back is when it found more than 100 targets over whatever loiter or sortie time it had. Maybe it's AOR covered per day to find targets. Again, because knock on wood, we're not in a shooting war today. We can use that environment to set the stage for what we can and can't do. The battle management centers that are coming online from C3BM are thirsty for more track information. Space is great and it provides us great situational awareness, but it's warned ISR. If the adversary doesn't know that a CCA is going to be there on any given day and it can sense in a different perspective than our overhead assets, I think it holds our adversaries at risk and it might even prevent wars from starting because there's kind of this ever-looking eye across multiple domains.
Well, and it injects uncertainty to the adversary. So it's not just simply that they know that they're being observed, but they know, but they don't know. They don't know how. They don't know what the CCA is going to bring to the game.
I just want to lean in on what Mike said and just reiterate that it's okay that we don't have this figured out.
Yeah.
I think because of what we're trying to do and how novel it is, the mating of these high performance unmanned systems with modern software development, to his point, that can be rapidly iterated and changed and overall fundamentally change the capability of the platform so long as it's within the aerodynamic and structural capability of platform. It is okay that we still have some to figure out. But that's what's exciting about the program. It is being able to lay the groundwork for what the future iterations could look like, what the future force structure of our United States Air Force could look like, for overall this ultimately does come back to the overall way that the Air Force thinks about training of air crew, or really just the production of capable people in general, is that production, absorption, retention. And when you think about production, absorption, retention, these have the opportunity to fundamentally change. How do we train the people that are going to be on the front lines of these pointy nose jets? How are we going to absorb them into a squadron? Is that squadron a mixed bag of F-35 and CCA? Are they disaggregated? And then retaining them and training them appropriately so they find value in what they're doing. I think my friends who still fly, and I'm jealous of them every freaking day, is because they are going to have the opportunity to go meaningfully conduct operations, layer in the risk on these things, and still come home. And so that production, absorption, retention, this program and its subsequent offerings will have a meaningful opportunity to just fundamentally change how we conduct operations. But ultimately, I don't want to lose sight. This is about either deterring the conflict, but if we don't deter, we have to go win.
Yes.
We have to go win.
Yes.
And so these have to provide relevant combat capability. And I believe that both of our offerings do.
Well, I think it's interesting because if you look at the notion of debriefing, how do you learn from the battle space? How do you debrief? How do you improve? The CCA, what they can bring, especially with all of their sensors, is how does the adversary behave in novel and more reserved modes? What are we seeing them do? How can we analyze those patterns and more rapidly iterate not just CCA, TTP's capabilities and behaviors, but human TTP's capabilities and behaviors? And you can actually even make bespoke responses to whatever is happening within that local environment. So you might have a different agent and different program for what's going on in the Middle East versus what's going on in the South China Sea versus so you could be more specific and more lethal depending on what you're able to collect through the CCAs and their behaviors.
And certainly when it comes to the overall software, it doesn't, as I get older, my muscles are atrophying quicker and it's frustrating as all heck. But, robots don't have muscles that atrophy. So if you don't power it on for 3 months, it is as capable then as it was 3 months ago.
Dude, you clearly don't own airplanes. If they sit, they break.
That's valid. That's so valid. Yeah. The ultimate
we talk about that debriefing just for a second.
Yeah, because Mike, you brought it up. Yeah.
Yeah, what we're doing on the domestic range is interesting, and we're finding missing physics that we need to do that the human's like, hey, you didn't think about this, and we add it. But if we do a combat deployment and we're out there flying around a CCA and here comes a hypersonic weapon from our adversary, well, we should probably put that hypersonic weapon in the virtual training environment. Or, hey, the bad guys come in 18 aircraft instead of 4. We should probably put that in the environment. We're not going to know how to train these agents unless we understand how the adversary reacts to them in relevant ways. So I think, Lucky, your question was kind of like, how do we work with the debriefing on the blue pilots? But I'm actually more interested in finding the physics of how red behaves, because I can't model everything.
Yeah, no, that's exactly
stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. There's things that we would see from red that would allow us to refine and improve the agents for the CCAs.
And I think CCAs are progressive enough that they're going to have to dip into their technology toolbox a little bit deeper than they are right now. And if they're all day, every day bumblebees buzzing around their picnic, I think it's a little more threatening than a bald eagle sitting back in a tree just watching, right? And so I'm very for this bumblebee, see how they react, and then teach the bumblebees to deal with that cause and effect reaction. And I can't do that without a combat deployment.
I really like that. So I got to ask you guys, since I have you both here, will the 42 and 44 talk and play together?
Oh, of course.
Yeah, they will.
Yes, of course. Scar and I talk about this late at night. I really want to see Anduril autonomy on a GA CCA, and I'd love to have GA's autonomy fly on a Anduril CCA. I think we are warfighter first organizations, both Anduril and General Atomics, and we just want to get hardware in their hands as soon as often. As much as it's fun to compete and motivate each other, we're in this for America and national security. And we're all in and collaborating with the SPO to provide the best warfighting capability.
And I think what's also interesting about, so I have nothing to add to what Mike just said. One thing I would contribute here, though, is, it's not add, I'm contributing, is when you allow the space of the creativity to be open, you just have some attributes or some desires you want to get. You actually allow that creativity of the engineers to come up with the solution as appropriate for that mission set. And if you take a look, if you've been to an AFA over the last couple months, or you go to a trade show coming near you sometime this year, you'll see both Anduril and GA's offerings, and they look completely different. But that just shows the open space that is the mission space. And you can still accomplish it in collaborative and different ways. And we both bring strengths, we both bring opportunities for growth, and we both bring the ability to augment each other even when airborne. And so I think that's what's exciting.
And additionally, because your offerings look so different, the vehicles, they've got different aerodynamics. To me, a heterogeneous and diverse portfolio of CCA, you'll be able to bring your software algorithms, your AI approaches, the autonomy, the unique ways that y'all think about how you build the agent and how you missionize that, and be able to iterate that across a variety of different, proliferate that across a variety of different platforms.
I'll tell you this, and this is not something most people think about very much. I've had more success and fun doing unmanned system teaming than trying to do crewed, uncrewed teaming. There's a certain culture with the RQ-170, the Global Hawk, the MQ-9 community of we kind of understand the tradecraft a little bit better, and we actually can collaborate and optimize the warfighting tactics a little bit better. But when we try to bring in an outside community, like the fighter community, the crewed uncrewed teaming is very hard because of the cultural impediments. I think you could see a future where an RQ-170 is out in front doing, penetrating ISR. You have a CCA in the mid game, hucking weapons, sensing, causing disruption, and you have something like a Global Hawk. You have something like an MQ-9 Reaper behind it, kind of being the 700-pound supercomputer, the data link assurance outside of the battle space. And that force structure, I think, could be an absolute game changer against how our adversaries are thinking about the problem.
And I think that the advantage of the software from the CCAs is that it gives us the flexibility to do agile software drops that allow them to interact with and play with and team with unique TTPs depending on who they ping and who they connect with.
The over-the-air update that is a TRL-9, millions of vehicles sitting in your driveway right now. That ability to increase the capability or adapt the capability real time on a fielded system is incredibly important. It is incredibly important. It is a new opportunity and a new trade space for us to explore with these vehicles.
So are we going to have a new AFSC that is going to be a Sky Geek? So you've got a software engineer that's embedded either within the squadron or within maintenance, and they are downloading the information from the CCA. They are gonculating, they are missionizing for the next one.
We already have that function today. We embed software programmers with the debrief to the comments that I made earlier. There's a maintainer of AI software in the force structure in the future. That maintainer doesn't have to, live in the middle of the South China Sea. He can sit in his house in San Francisco and download and update the physics that are used to train the agents. And every time that jet sorties, it has different source code on it.
If we have connectivity.
But we don't need connectivity through space. I think people get wound up about a day without space. But in the analogy that I just gave you of unmanned teaming, I can push data links through an air layer. I can push them through a sea layer. I can go
mesh your way there.
Air to air. There are so many ways through the transport matrix with what the U.S. is working on. I think Ukraine has taught us that. All the way back to I can put out a mile worth of fiber optic cable from a Reaper to a CCA if I really have to.
So we're getting close on time, but I do want to manage expectations, right? Because there is so much to be excited about regarding the potential for CCA, the capabilities these agents are going to deliver, and the vectors that both of your companies are on. And we absolutely need to have them here. But can you say something? We've talked about schedule, and we have to be absolutely rigid and diligent about schedule. But I think people are expecting R2-D2 tomorrow, right? And they also think R2-D2 is going to be like 3 cents. Can we talk a little bit about cost and capability?
Yeah, I think this is going to be hard. There's no way about it. As much as, Mike has detailed it, and our company has fielded systems that leverage edge autonomy. This is a challenging problem that requires extreme focus. It requires data. It requires reps and sets and the willingness to train and learn, field, break, relearn. It requires the access to the assets. This is not something I'll lean in on. Cars that leverage the ability to drive themselves, like Teslas or whatever. There are millions of those vehicles out there right now actively collecting data by which they can train. We have to get to that fundamental data generation in relevant scenarios to ultimately create this software capability. So I completely agree. The sky is the limit. There is a real opportunity that everybody who's listening should be excited about, and we need to field it ASAPly. But we are going to have to take time. It is going to take time to get to that full up combat capability.
I think we need to be realistic so that as you move forward and as you experience certain failures, because as you're doing new things, you are inventing new stuff. We have to give space for failure, but we can't allow people to think, oh, well, let's just throw it all out. We have to realize this is part of normal growing pains. And by setting the appropriate expectations of performance and behavior and giving some space for those experimental failures and learning points, that's the only way that we're going to really be successful. But you also need the cash. No bucks, no Buck Rogers. Mike, what are your thoughts on cost and capability?
Yeah, I mean, I feel that we live in a great time where I have all the technology I need to achieve everything we talked about on the podcast today. R2-D2 is real. I have it right now. The problem is I don't know what to do with it. I don't know how to integrate it in my household. And maybe R2-D2 should have been C3PO. And so I need to learn how it's going to integrate within the culture. And I feel excited for the future. I think the average person in America should have confidence that us in the defense industry are providing the war system we need to keep, America safe. So to my point, technology's here. We just need to figure out how we're going to use it. And I think that's the limiting factor in how quickly we're going to see it downrange.
So then let's end this episode on a there I was, right? As you project your thought experiment into the future, or even just vectors of where you've been and what you've already done with your CCAs. Can you give us a notional and unclassified vignette of what you think this future is going to look like?
Yeah, I think much like we've seen on CNN with the Reaper, we're going to wake up on the news and we're going to hear about a fighter escort that a CCA did against a Russian bomber that was coming against somewhere in our Indo-Pacific theater, and there will be live videos streamed from the CCA, and just doing that day in, day out will desensitize our adversaries that we never have to deal with the eventual World War III situation. And if we do have to deal with a World War III situation and that bomber does launch an air-launched cruise missile against something, you're going to see a robot airplane rush to take a kamikaze death to save lives. And I think that those robots will be the first indication and warnings of how bad this is going to go. And eventually that will become the landscape by which we exert our national power.
Scar, what's your there I was story?
Yeah, I think what you're going to see, and I'll harken back to the early Raptor days, where in the early Raptor days, people would come out of training missions, they'd say, we got slayed, or it did some amazing work. It ultimately moved the needle in a measurable way to achieve our combat objectives. And I think in a handful of years, you will have a bunch of debriefs come out of, whether it be in simulation environment or at a red flag or somewhere else, and they're going to stand up and say, these things made a meaningful difference, and we are going, because of that, it's actually going to keep conflict from even happening in the first place because of how amazing it did. And so I'm excited for us to work with the Air Force. I'm excited to work with the Joint Force and our international partners to facilitate the overall success, to actually just keep conflict from happening because it's so good at what it does.
No, I should have said, instead of there I was, there I will be, because I agree with both of you. I think CCA are going to absolutely revolutionize TTPs. They're going to have incredible impact on how we are able to really penetrate what we considered highly lethal threat wedges and go downtown. And that's really going to be what enables us to deter and, if necessary, kick ass in a future conflict. Gentlemen, there's so much more we could talk about. I love geeking out with you. Thank you both for being here. Mike, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's always a pleasure, and I love your energy, Lucky.
Scar.
Lucky, as always, this is awesome. Mike, good to see you, and I'm looking forward to the next time.
With that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's discussion. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button and follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great aerospace power kind of day. See you next time. Okay. Dudes, we totally never, we hit the script on the first question. We never went back.
I was like texting. I was like,
we went Nardo.
Dude, but what you guys were saying was so interesting. I just had to keep going with it.
I blacked out. What did we say?
Don't.
What just happens?
But it was a great conversation. Thank you.
There is so much that we have to explore. There is.
Yeah.
Like there is so much more ahead. We have only gotten the tip of the iceberg. There's just a lot that we've got to do, and it's pretty freaking awesome.
Hey, Lucky, as you were prepping for the show, and maybe you did some due diligence, I mean, what do you think the average person that's in your demographic of listeners really is confused about or wants to know more about? I mean, obviously you wrote the questions, but are you seeing something emerge that's more direct?
Yeah. So there's a lot of young Air Force officers that do not understand CCA. They do not like collaborative combat aircraft. They think they're being fully replaced. They don't understand like how the autonomy works. So there's either they totally hit the I trust button or they totally hit the I don't trust button. So they lack the nuances. You have a lot of folks that are very, very savvy. And so we're trying to reach both audiences to bring the awareness up of overall what CCA are, what the potential operational concepts are, how they could impact, how they're going to move forward. But yeah,
well, then I think
it's
we hit it then, because I think talking in some of these analogies, talking about the past and
the bumblebees. I love the bumblebees. I wasn't totally on board with the mice and the cheese.
I was like, what mice, moldy cheese? Why are the mice eating moldy cheese? I am like, what is happening?
But I realize what you're really talking about is, I mean, trying to address the entire breadth of red behaviors, whether or not that's a war reserve mode, decoys, deception, lethal effects. So I mean, as you're dealing with all of that, yes, it's not your ideal solution. You're training your agents for a wide variety of different scenarios.
Yeah. And that's the problem right now, is that when we break down the software development activities, we don't know where to focus, right? We can't do it all. We can't boil the ocean. So what are we trying to really go after right now? What is the Air Force going to pay for? What do we need to do more transformationally on our own passion? It's a challenge right now.
No, I think I've actually kickstarted a Air Force Doctrine 101 brief that I've started to give to engineers. Mm-hmm. And it really just gets after the mission space that these vehicles could participate in. And to Mike's point, the specific utilization is a wide grace, but is it SEED? Is it OCA? Is it DCA? Mm-hmm. Are we just out there to do sweep, or what are we doing? And so that focus, I've said this before, there is actually freedom in restriction. Like once you have that focus point, then you can go execute extremely well on that point. And so to Mike's point, the particular mission case that we want to use these against will enable that hyper development of that autonomy against that use case. And then we can continue to iterate from there. Yep. But when everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And if you just go boil the ocean autonomy, like just sprinkle some AI on it and suddenly everything will work out great. Like that is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, exactly. And failed expectations, right? I mean, people think it's as general, they think it's as smart as a human.
Oh my gosh.
And that just isn't, I think, how autonomy works.
No, it's an exciting amount of work ahead.
It surely is.
No doubt.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Been super generous. And hopefully we can get you both back together again. I mean, I know that the calendar thing was pretty crazy, but thank you both for making the time.
Mike and I are going to just start a monthly recurring here. It'll be called like Musings with Mike and Scar. And we'll get after it for about 55.
Fireside chat.
Fireside chat is like 55 minutes of just opining on things that we find important. And it'll be good.
Well, it sounds like we need to bring tasty beverages.
That would make this even freaking better.
Like a true fighter pilot.
And it has to be on a back deck with a fire going. That's actually what it has.
Good with that. Yeah. Awesome.
Okay,
hey, thanks, guys.
Lunch before I run out of time.
All right. See you. Thanks.
See you guys.
Okay.